Oh, Angie. Hi guys, it's Laura of Open Testa. How are you doing? I just turned off the air conditioner, the dehumidifier, the fish tank. There are all these noisy things here. And I wanted to give you a lesson about facings for pattern making. I have a course, everyone teaches these things in a different way. But my first teaching job, I never thought I was even going to be a teacher. After I graduated fashion school in 1995, in 1997, one of my former teachers had become the chair of the fashion department at Parsons School of Design, and she invited me. My first course was pattern making. After that, I taught draping and sewing, which is hand and machine stuff, for like 5 years. And then after I had 2 babies in 2 years, I took some time off and taught other things before I came back teaching illustration and design. So those are some background things about me. But I started teaching pattern making again last year at Parsons, and it just woke up in me like all this love. Plus, teaching pattern making now, after teaching so much draping and sewing, just brought it full circle. So it's like super, super fun to share all these discoveries with you, because what I find happens is when I learned pattern making, sorry, this light is like weird. When I learned pattern making, and the way a lot of pattern making can be taught sometimes, it gets so techy that people just kind of shut down. And one really nice feedback I had got from one of my students was how it's a very relaxed environment, and it's playful and it's fun, and you can watch the videos again and again, so you don't like freeze up and get scared. I find different people learn in different ways, and that some people, even after weeks of study, they'll sometimes be so focused on the 1/8 of an inch, 1/16 of an inch, do this, do that, like you see in the pattern making book. They're so focused on the details, and of course this could happen to any of us, so focused on the details that they don't realize why they're doing what they're doing. That they can choose if it's a 1/4 inch or 1/8 of an inch based on understanding how it works, based on understanding how it relates to their body. So in my online course, later check, I'm going to post in this post, I'll add like the course link. And I'm just doing like a 2-day coupon if anyone's interested, and putting it out there for just $49 with the coupon, because I create these courses, but I'd rather have people in them doing the stuff. And in the course, you can also share your practice drafts and stuff. And like what we do is we use mini patterns so that you can, we do some of it full size too. Like I will draft a full size collar, band collar, and then put it up on the mannequin so you can see how the pattern pieces relate to the finished piece. Oh, I'm pointing to my mannequin, but you can't see it. Actually, I just got this one donated, and look, it's brand new. I have a friend who works in real estate, and he was selling a fashion designer's house, and the fashion designer was getting rid of the mannequin. I've never had one with legs except at school, so I'm really excited. But anyway, today I'm going to walk you through something about facings, because I had created this video for the course and it didn't save. So I'm like, oh, let's just make a new video live today. So that will be really fun. What I'm going to show you is I'm just going to take a basic bodice, and we're going to create a neckline facing and an armhole facing, and show you also what happens with a deep neckline facing. They can tend to stretch and gape. So we'll talk about how and why you can make the facing smaller. And also just remember, once you understand how that works, it becomes very easy for you to create different shaped necklines. Because sometimes a garment fits great, but like for your body type, a certain neckline is way better than another one, right? Like for me, yeah, it's amazing how one neckline can ruin the way I look and another neckline can make me look awesome. I always think it's never us that's the problem. We blame ourselves and be like, I don't like my shoulders, I don't like my whatever. But we all know that when we wear something that fits and looks great on us, we feel like $1,000,000, and it's out there. It's just that so often we're trying on clothes that don't fit, right? So let's go. Let's have a lesson about facings. Oh, you know what? I don't even know if there's a chat enabled here, but whatever. I'm just going to go in. Sorry, we're gonna turn sideways now. Is that a problem? Okay, I'm gonna flip and do all that. And we're gonna work in the small scale in the pattern book. And I just realized I set my tripod up. I had set it up as, what do you call it? Horizontal. I just have to adjust it. Uh-oh. Hang on. Okay. Ta-da! We're going to work like this today. Not exactly how I planned, but yeah, okay. So let's talk about just some very simple basic rules that you can use to create facing pattern. All right. So I'm going to use this, and I'm going to let me grab some other piece of paper over here. And let's just, I mean, everyone's at different levels. Some of you may not even know what, well, some people don't know what a facing is because they start studying design and they haven't sewn yet. But I know this group is called So Much Talent. So people have been sewing. I'm using a see-through ruler. I bet you all have these. I know I can't live without one. I don't know about you. I can't live without these. I use a 1. You'll see why I use it. I also use this. I use both a lot. I can't have one and not the other because this is big and clunky, but it also has its benefits. This is so small and is good for like creating curve shapes and stuff. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to trace 2 bodices. This is a torso draft, so it goes all the way to the hip. It has a fisheye dart, which is a dart that goes from, it gives you all the width you need. I'm going to use the bust first. All the width you need at the bust, the narrowness of the waist, and then the width you need at the hip. Right? So it goes in and out. And you can see how it's just like a diamond. We'll talk more about that. But remember that even if it's marked like this, when you're stitching, you can actually use like an S. You can create a gentle S around the straight line as you stitch. And that would curve to the contours of the body a little more if you ever want to do that. You have that permission to yourself. And that when you stitch a dart like this, I didn't plan on talking about this, but I love nerding out about fashion. You can either begin and end with a back stitch, but if your machine is a little cranky, you may just want to start and end right at the dart points. And then what I do is I pull up on my needle thread that I stitched, and the bobbin thread will come up, and I'll stitch the 2 together. Not stitch the 2, sorry. I'll have my bobbin and my needle thread both coming up out of the fabric, and I tie 3 knots to finish them, and then I snip like 1/8 of an inch away. That allows me to stop on a dime. Whereas I can back stitch on a dime, but sometimes it will pucker or make a thick or stretched distortion in my stitching. So if I just end on a single needle point and end on a single needle point, I can just pull on my thread so that my bobbin and needle thread are both on one side of the fabric, and I just tie 3 little knots and snip 1/8 of an inch away. All right, I got off topic. But you know, because we're all fashion nerds in this group, right? So I'm actually going to work first by just tracing the sloper. Sloper is just a pattern that has no seam allowance on it. So here we go. And then I'm going to work on graph paper so we can think about the grain and stuff. I just want a copy of my sloper. The online class that I made actually comes with slopers, but they're not plastic, they're cardboard. This one I had ordered, picked up at a place, I can tell you where later. Can use an awl to mark the bust point and the dart points, even though I don't really need that right now. I just want you to know that those markings are on this. What'd you say, Angie?
We gotta go to Party Depot and visit Farm.
Okay, we'll do that soon. Actually, that's Home Depot, Angie.
Home Depot, right.
Okay, so I'm just going to work with the basic, I'm not putting darts right now. I'm just going to work on the facings. So I'm just going to work with that. And that's my front. If I wanted to add markings, I just add my my grain line. And I love the see-through ruler because even though I just did that sloppily, see-through ruler allows me to make a line that's exactly parallel to the center front line. And if it was going to be cut on fold, I would change my marking. I would do it this way, as you know, and that would be like center front on fold. And I could label. I like to put all my labelings right along my grain line. So I could call this bodice front. Now I have a front bodice. I'm going to keep the side dart and I'm just going to have it be a straight bodice there. And what we'll do is we'll design our own neckline and armhole variation, and then we'll add a facing to it. Now let's trace our back, which this back one is going to have the shoulder dart in it, which isn't going to affect our facing either, but just want to explain what that is. We could also talk about how to eliminate the shoulder dart. Those are things that you'll discuss in class. And this is interesting. This quarter scale sloper actually gives you the option to have a shaped center back seam. So you end up with a big hidden dart on your center back line, which is awesome because you get more fit that way. But again, I'm going to work with a very simple style here. So this is my back. If center front's on fold, center back can't be on fold, right? So our back, I'm still going to draw a green line. And then I'm going to write cut 2 because it's not on fold. This is going to be cut 1 on fold. All right, and then I'm going to cut these out. Oh no! I forgot to grab my scissors like I was going to. You know what else I did wrong? Okay, I'm feeling a little kooky. I do not want to use my fabric scissors for this, but I am right now. And what I realized is I marked my my back bodice. Oops, drawing my dart legs. The back is going to look different. Just a second here, I'll show you how it's going to look. These are my favorite scissors in the world. You probably all have these. If you don't, I would get those, and I would also never use them on paper. But oh well. And you know what's so awesome about them? Actually, I'm having a problem right now because I got them sharpened in the garment district. And look at this. When they put them back together, the tips don't match. And it's because I gave them 2 pairs at once. I put them back together 10 different ways and never got it to match. So I have to go back. But the great thing about these scissors, you can even use them as a seam ripper because they're small enough to pull out a seam. Like a stitch. They fit inside a stitch. And they also allow you to snip precisely to where you need to. And they're super sharp. Okay, so here's my... Again, I'm not going to show you while I'm cutting paper with my fabric scissors because it's so horrendous of a thought that I shouldn't even show you. Never cut your paper with your fabric scissors, right guys? Okay, so I'm almost done cutting out the sloper, and then I'm going to put it on graph paper because then graph paper will feel like fabric grain. So here's my front sloper. And here's my back. Remember, we said, so because I traced it backwards, because I'm still not used to using see-through patterns, so I'm going to remark this. So this is center back is here. I'm going to put a little grain line on there because you always want to have your grain line in case this was bias or something different. And then I can put cut 2. Because this is my back pattern top. Okay, so again, what are we talking about today? Let me just double check because I don't see, swipe left to see comments. Just want to make sure comments are enabled in case anyone has questions. So we wanted to create facings today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tape these down. Oh, yeah, so many things I'd like to share with you. I'm going to try to keep it basic, but I always think that the variations are such the exciting part that I always end up wanting to tell you things that are variation. I'm using magic tape because magic tape is that matte finish. So it's really easy to draw on with a pencil or pen. Use the sharpest pencil you can so that your lines are super precise. I'm not doing that right now because I find that for these videos, a very fine, sharp pencil isn't visible enough, so I use something bolder so you can see it. And again, at the end of this, I'll give you information about this special coupon thing in case you're interested in learning more with me. So let's say I wanted to design a new neckline. I wanted to show you two necklines on here because a deep neckline and a regular neckline are going to act differently. So first thing is, when you have commercial patterns, this is a sloper, so it has no seam allowance at all. And in the course, you will get your own cardboard mini slopers that you print. So you always have to add your own seam allowance. And that's, for me, that's huge. Like, I learned to sew from commercial patterns, and there's so many markings on there. All the sizes are on there. I always got so upset because they never, ever fit. Maybe once in a while. And I also got upset because I didn't know the why behind stuff. So the cool thing about slopers is all of these different lines actually represent the stitching lines, or the stitching line. So this is like your finished garment. The seam allowance is extra that we add later, right? So like for this pattern, you know, I would add seam allowance at the end of my pattern making. I'll add the seam allowance beyond the stitch line. But you don't do that. You start with a bare bones pattern that has no seam allowance, because that's where you make all the new shapes first. Then you add seam allowance to them. So let's say I wanted to make a basic neckline, just like this one, and then add a facing to it. I get to decide how big the facing is. So let's say this is quarter scale. I'm just going to pretend that these 1/8 inch lines are actually, what I could call it, inches. So this for me is a 2-inch wide facing, and I can just kind of plot it out. How did I do it? I guess it should be closer for you guys. I took my see-through ruler and I measured parallel to the seam line or the neckline. And I just measure parallel. So if it were a full-size pattern, you know, I might do 2 inches or 1 inch. It's up to you. Okay, and that becomes my facing pattern. But how do I transfer it? You can either use tracing paper or you can use a pattern wheel. Either one is gonna give you a new pattern piece. So watch, if I do it with my wheel, I like to kind of jiggle back and forth repeatedly, to get a more visible line. It's going to leave little holes. You want to be really precise. And see, there's my new pattern piece. I don't know if you can see it. I certainly can. It's very, very clear to me. I really want to bring this down closer, but I'm afraid things will get worse instead of better. So yeah, like they just did. Give me a second, guys, because I'm stepping on the wire. Sorry, don't mean to make anyone car sick. Okay, and then I can come back with my ruler or freehand, but preferably with my ruler, and here's my new pattern piece. The other really easy way to do that is to just trace what's already there, right? Like just, I'm going to show you both ways because I want you to leave here with like different things work for different situations, and I want you to leave here with things you can really apply to your life. Whoops. Okay, so this is the point is I want it to be parallel to the neckline. Okay, but there's an adjustment. So I want to teach you the adjustment. Thing is, something like this, once you cut it out, you could get confused. So you want to make sure that you mark like that this is center front. And remember, we were cutting center front on fold. So this will be cut on fold too. So you can do your, this is a tiny, tiny piece to work on, but this would be easy to do at full size. Now the thing is, with a facing for a neckline, your shoulder, you want the two necklines to be identical length and shape. But at the shoulder, you keep the side neck point but the shoulder line is going to come in like 1/8 of an inch, just a little bit. It'll be slightly smaller so that when your facing is attached to your neckline, it's not going to make a big bulky kind of lump that sticks out of your shoulder seam. So my facing pattern, front neckline facing, is going to be slightly smaller. Oh, neckline facing. And the beautiful thing about knowing this stuff is that if you want to design a different neckline on whatever you've got, you just design it, sketch it out, and then you can create a facing for that. By tracing it through, it's going to be identical. You're going to decide how wide you want it for, you know, there's a lot of different reasons. You might even want it to blend right into your armhole. Okay, I'm doing all-in-one facing. Cool, right? But in that case, you won't be making this adjustment in the neckline. So this could be an all-in-one facing, but the markings come right off your pattern. So this is in the event that, let's say I wanted to do, this is my neckline. I'll trace those outlines, keep my shoulder seam, keep my center front, and then trace my armhole, decide how wide I want my facing to be at the side seam, and then you can just blend this gently, freehand, however you want. Just remember that at your center front, you want to have a right angle, so that when you trace it over on fold or cut it out on fold, you get a nice blend from left to right without getting a point that goes down or a point that goes up. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you will when it happens to you. It even happens sometimes when you cut, right? You know that. Okay, and on a facing like this, I would keep my armhole notch from my original pattern piece. But here's the other thing. Remember how I told you that for a facing that's in your shoulder, that we're going to blend it down a little, just like 1/8 of an inch, to reduce the bulk of the seam allowance in your shoulder? Well, same thing for your armhole. So if this is your armhole facing, you're also going to bring it in here. Especially here, you have more room for it to just kind of come a little closer to the body. And I always use little tick marks to mark lines that don't exist anymore. I just X them out. That's my like little language that tells me which markings are the new markings and which markings are like getting erased. All right, so this is my notch. This is my armhole. And I often use a ruler, not a curve, to create curves, but you can use a ruler. You can also use, I'm going to show you in a second. You can also, that's why I like this small ruler, because it's very easy to manipulate. But you can also use your hand. There's a natural curve in your fingers and wrist that is extremely useful for necklines, armholes, skirt hems, everything. So now we've created a square facing, a natural facing for the original neckline, and I'm going to show you one more kind of facing. But before I do, I'm going to take this pattern. And the thing is, if you're starting with a commercial pattern, you see how I am about to add seam allowance to my pattern piece. What you need to do is you need to subtract seam allowance from your pattern piece. So if it's a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, you're going to need to use a ruler like this to remove the seam allowance to get to the stitch lines. But it's easy. You just go parallel to the stitch lines. You just need to make sure that you know what the seam allowance is. So if it's 5/8 of an inch, you need to measure in 5/8 of an inch. This still needs a grain line, and the grain line is generally parallel to center front. All right. here we go. Now we have, you know, 2 different variations of necklines. I'm going to show you how, I'm kind of like rushing through because I don't want to, you know, keep you all day, but I'm going to add seam allowance now. If it's something that I'm going to have a fitting, I would leave a bigger seam allowance, like 1 inch, even 2 inches, so that during a fitting, I can adjust it. But if it's something I've already tested, if it's something I've already used and I'm just sewing it up, then I'll use a much smaller seam allowance. So you'll see me do that here. So I'm looking for a new colored pencil so you can see the difference between the seam allowance, yeah, and the actual stitch line. So I'm going parallel to the armhole. I'm just going to do 1 inch everywhere. Using the inch to represent the 1/8 of an inch to represent. So see how I'm adding the seam allowance to everything? Okay. And another thing I do to keep track of how much seam allowance I've added, you need to be very precise when you do this. If your pencil tip is not very fine, watch what happens when I use a ruler like this. If I do this, my line is right up against the ruler. If I hold my pencil this way, my line is almost 1/8 of an inch away from the ruler, which means I'm making my pattern piece bigger and bigger and bigger. So you do want to be precise. You want to use a sharp, maybe a mechanical pencil, and aim it at your ruler. But I always keep several colors so I can continually make corrections to things. So this is a facing with seam allowance everywhere. No seam allowance here because this is on fold, which would not be hard to indicate if I was using a full-size pattern, but this is just a mini. I could do my little symbols. Front facing, cut 1 on fold. And you could also indicate self fabric or lining or contrast fabric. So I could put the fabric note here if I want. Okay, and now I want to show you another trick that you probably know, but you probably don't know if you haven't done pattern making. And again, don't watch while I use my fabric scissors to cut pattern paper because I shouldn't do that. By the way, if you want really great pattern paper that's affordable, I don't know if you guys know. Oh my gosh, where is mine? I don't know if you know about what they call medical pattern paper. It's the paper that doctors use on their examining tables. And it's a white paper that's very see-through, very human-sized for pattern making, and affordable. So if you ever see the words medical pattern paper on Amazon, that's what it is. I get it free from my dad's office because he's a doctor. I didn't add seam allowance here because I don't usually like to fold and hem my facings because it creates bulk, but you always have choices. You can always decide these things. I would rather just like serge the edge of this, right? Just have like serging. But if you wanted to fold it and actually wanted to add like a whole allowance to it for hemming, you know, same exact process that we already used. But the thing about learning about how a facing is created gives you the freedom to create any shape you want in an armhole or a neckline, or even like if you want to create scallops on a hem or something. But here's a trick. Your seam allowance needs shaping. So what I mean is, okay, whenever I trace my lines, I just kind of go, whenever I draw lines, I draw them kind of forever. It's one very important thing I learned in drawing and pattern making. Think of the lines as going on forever, okay? So that if you need to make an adjustment, you have a guideline to move along. It's already there. But when you sew, you kind of know whether that shoulder seam is going to be pressed open, or are both seam allowances going to be pressed towards the front or the back. when you know that, okay, if it's going to be pressed open, then the seam allowance is actually going to be against the garment like this, right? If I know that's true, then I'm going to cut my seam allowance while the pattern piece is folded the same way that it would be sewn. And I'm also, I know this may seem overwhelming or not, I don't even know, but the fact is when you can watch these things over and over again, it doesn't matter, like it sinks in. It's going to give you the shape that you need. Like sometimes, let's say this was a scooped out, you know, your seam allowance would have to be shaped to accommodate it. So I just made that correction, but it didn't actually affect my pattern that much in this situation. But folding before you cut your fabric or your pattern is going to help a lot. And the same is true, whoops, I got lost. When I get to the side seam, see how it goes down? That means my seam allowance is actually going to go up so that it can fit into the seam. So watch what happens when I cut this out with the paper folded. Da, da, da. Hang on. See how it goes back up? Like you wouldn't have known that just by doing your, hang on, your pencil thing. So almost done here. I'm gonna cut this out. See the new shaping? How we that's called truing the seam allowance. That could be super helpful. And then I'm gonna cut here. Again, everybody close your eyes because I'm cutting with my paper scissors, my fabric scissors. It's like the cardinal sin of workroom. I would never do this, but I started the video without my scissors. I just got them sharpened too. So now I have an all-in-one facing for the arm line and neck hole, and you can see that they're a perfect match. So if I wanted a different shaped armhole, if I create that new shape, da, 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 all I have to do is, you know, my facing will use the same shape. And if I change my armhole, same thing. So I want to give you guys one more tidbit before we leave, and I'm sure it's probably quite too much. But let's say I took my front bodice and I actually want to do a deep neckline. So I'm going to do just a really deep V. So now I'm going to use my pencil and create this deep V neck. I'm sure you've all gone through this experience where if you do a deep V or a deep scoop, it starts to get all stretched out because this is my length grain. Length grain and cross grain on your fabric are a single thread. This is a single thread that runs from beyond your garment into your garment and then off, right? Single thread, infinite. When you have a deep neckline that's diagonal like this, or even like a scoopy neckline, this goes through the bias. Bias is not a single thread. It's it goes through the diagonal, so all the threads are stretchy. Angie, can you wait like 5 more minutes before you sing? I'm almost done. So this all gets stretchy. So when you stitch it to itself, the whole thing starts to ripple and wave, and it kind of falls off your body right where you need it to hug, which is, you know, over the bust. There's a few reasons for this. Another reason for that is simply because, here we go. The area above, if you're doing a full size, Angie, shh, just a sec, okay? Hello. So if you're just doing a bodice, like a straight shirt that's just crisp, like a blouse or something, it doesn't matter that you don't have fitting through this concave area, right? You see how it's concave? Wait, whoa, hang on. I wasn't going to do this part, but here we go. All right, you see how this is not a straight line? Hang on. Hang on. See how that's a straight line. Okay, but your body may be like this. Depends what bra you're wearing. Depends on your body type. A lot of things, okay? but because it scoops in, you sort of want your pattern to scoop in. You want it to pull in towards the body more. So not only is this stretchy, but it's also hanging out in the air anyway. So there's a way we can make this smaller, and I want to show you that. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm sorry that my camera's kind of... Are we still live? Because my tripod... Oh no! Oh, glad I didn't like swear. My tripod turned off my phone, and I thought I lost the live stream. But it's still here. Oh, I was so upset. Okay, so I'm going to teach you... I should probably teach you this on a full scale because it'll be so much easier to see. Well, let's just do it. So if you have a deep neckline, you take a fresh piece of like tracey paper, and I'm going to trace that new deep neckline. Well, there's two ways I could trace. I could trace it by seeing through the paper, or I can trace it with my wheel. So let's say I'm doing this deep neckline here. I also need to trace my shoulder line and my center front line, because I'm going to need both of those to make a facing pattern. I'm giving you guys this advanced training. Now I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I'm probably overwhelming everybody. Because before we get into this in my class, it's simple stuff like to show you where the sloper comes from. Like how do we drape a basic front bodice sloper or sleeve sloper or skirt sloper that fits, and then then I teach you how to make all the adjustments. But the big thing is I want you to have all the basics understood first. So let's say this is my neckline, okay? If it's a long, possibly stretchy seam, which it is, because we talked about that, right? That it's stretchy because it's in the bias, because we know that our straight grain is parallel to center front. So this would be a stretchy kind of bias thing. One thing you could do is you could rotate this onto... No, I wouldn't do that. Never mind. How can we make this neckline edge a little bit easier to fit? And what I do is I put a notch in the middle of my neckline, and I put the matching notch. I'm going to put a notch in this neckline, in the same spot, but just seeing through. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make this smaller by slashing. And depending how big and scoopy and stretchy your pattern is, you may have to do this in a few times, like twice instead of once. Like if it was a big scooped out round pattern piece, I would have to do it more than once. Cut it out so I have the basic pattern piece here first. Okay. What I'm going to do is slash this pattern and make the facing a little bit. I slashed two, but not through that outside edge. And I'm going to, let me use the graph paper here so that I can still have grain lines on my pattern. See, this is my facing, but I'm actually going to make this facing, whoops, it's here, sorry, a little bit smaller than the original neckline. Hang on, why does that not look right? Okay, here, so this would be if they matched, but if I actually cut my facing slightly smaller, it's slightly shorter in length, depending on the fabric, you might even need it to be a lot shorter in length. Because what will happen is having the facing be slightly smaller will help that neckline squeeze come in closer to the body. And it may just bring you back to square one. Like it may just compensate for the stretching that happens when you're stitching it. No matter how careful you are, they tend to stretch a little when they stitch. So here I did like an 1/8 inch plus an 1/8 inch overlap. So now my facing, hang on, is a shorter line than my neckline, and is going to help it be come closer to the body. Okay, it looks like this. I know it looks funny, but when you pin them together, you just put a little ease in between your pins so that you're slightly squishing your neckline into your facing. And another thing is I don't want my facing to be so long at center front, so I'm gonna just shorten it and blend and cut it out. And now I have a deep neckline facing. So there are more basic things that you'll learn, but I wanted to give you some like food for thought. Like you can, if you know something is going to stretch like this neckline, then you can actually make the pattern smaller by keeping the lines, but we just took some of the measurement out, the length measurement. And now this facing still needs seam allowance. So I would just put it on a fresh piece of paper. You could use alphabet paper, you can use tracing paper, you can use that medical paper I told you about. And if you're just practicing, you can use this kind of, you know, just regular old paper. So now I'm adding seam allowance to my facing. It's cut on center front fold. So there's my center front line. And I really need that notch to help me know where my facing matches up with my shirt. You know, and this still needs seam allowance all around too. Seems like a lot of, maybe it seems like a lot of time and work, but actually it's nothing to just add seam allowances everywhere and notches. Walk yourself through the, how would I sew this? But the thing is, understanding makes all the difference. Like, that's what I want. I want to understand why. So here's what I was mentioning before, but I didn't show you, is you may forget how much seam allowance you used in certain areas. Well, all you have to do, you can work it into your notches. So you can have notches that show you where to start stitching on all your pattern pieces, so that you always know how much seam allowance you're working with in a certain area. Like, you definitely need smaller seam allowance in curves. If you're someone who leaves larger seam allowance here or there, in very curved areas, you know that they need to be clipped anyway. So you might as well use a small seam allowance. And I need to make, like, if this were full size, it'd be much easier for me to write on it. I would say center front, neckline facing, cut on fold. But because this is the mini version, the quarter scale, remember I fold before I cut. I fold my seam allowance wherever it's going to go. And it gives me some shaping that, here it's subtle, but sometimes you need a lot of, sometimes it'll come, you know, in and out. Again, don't use a glossy tape, use that matte finish kind of tape. And this could be my facing piece for this top, with the facing being cut smaller in order to accommodate and control the stretch in the neckline, which sometimes that's called a stay. Like when you might use a ribbon. Some people even put like a little piece of twill tape in the seam allowance when they sew something like this to keep the neckline from stretching too much. And then what would I do with this? I would, let's just say, I may have confused you guys a little because I did a few different examples. I did an all-in-one, what did I do? Armhole neckline facing off a square neck from my basic bodice. Then I took my basic bodice and I created a V-neck instead, and I created a facing for that. A basic neckline facing I traced right on for you at the beginning. And it's on a piece of paper somewhere, but I don't know where that little scrappy went. Remember with that one, just to review, that was the one where we came in a little and made the side neck. Right out here, we came in just a little bit to bring the facing in from the body so you don't get a big lump on your outside garment. So we did a few different facing variations, but what we didn't do any seam allowance on our bodice itself. So again, your bodice, just remember that whatever the extremes of your pattern piece are, those are your stitch lines. So seam allowance is parallel to the stitch lines, right? Because that's how we put things together. Make sure you don't forget your markings, like notches in armhole. And this is why the see-through rollers are like priceless. And you would add that everywhere. And again, if this is something you were going to have a fitting with, then you might leave up to like 2 inches of seam allowance everywhere. But we're assuming this is a pattern you've already tested and used, and that you're actually just designing a variation that you're going to sew up. But you're like, oh, I already know it fits because we made this last week with a different neckline and it was fine. So that's the kind of stuff that I feel like we don't always get to know when we use commercial patterns, and sometimes it keeps us stuck. I mean, not even that, but that if you take clothes that you own and you want to just trace a dress that you have, you know, how do you trace the neckline? How do you add seam allowance? Where do you add seam allowance? Before I leave you, I'm going to just grab one little thing to show you. I'm grabbing the first piece of clothing I can find anywhere. Just this one right here. Hi! Thanks for saying hello. I just saw that. Everyone's so quiet. I love interacting with you guys. That's the part that brings me to life. Okay, so here's a dress. Now this one doesn't even have a facing. It's a double folded power mesh. But let's say I love this dress, which I do, but I want to make my own. I know that center front grain line has to be running down center front. And then I can trace this neckline as long as I have true grain. All right. And I know cross grain is here. So I can trace this neckline, trace this shoulder line, you know. And you know what's really cool about this one that I want to bring up is it actually, oh, I didn't know it has a stain on it. Has a scalloped armhole, which is a perfect example for the stuff we've been talking about today. So instead of having a partial facing in this armhole, they actually faced the entire bodice is self-faced. That's why you have a clean finish. There's not even any top stitching here. It's just clean finished, whereas on this edge, it is top stitched because that's how they attached the power mesh. But this piece is cut twice and faces itself, which also gives some nice privacy because you get a double layer in the bodice, which is great. And I want to show you something about sewing that you probably already know, how all of the seams are pressed inside the garment. They're all, when they're pressed, they're just inside, so no one has to look at them, right? Well, if you were creating a scalloped facing for the armhole, like on this dress, you could, I'm just going to sketch this out freehand. Let's say this was your armhole. And let's say you decided you wanted a scalloped armhole. So you can either sketch that or you can measure it all, you know, that they're all 1/8 of an inch tall or, you know, evenly spaced. All you have to do with that is a whole bunch of fractions and division, right? So let's say this becomes your armhole. Okay, and let's say this is the shoulder. And this is the neckline. Angie, by the way, I'll be done in less than 5 minutes, okay?
Okay.
This is the side seam. Okay, so let's say this is your new armhole. And you wanted to make a facing for it, like the dress I just showed you. Again, don't use a pencil that's so thick like the one I'm using, but I do that so you can see. My armhole facing, normally I trace these things with, what do you call it, with a ruler. But I'm just doing this freehand right now. See, okay, here's the scalloped armhole. But my facing, which is inside the garment, I could actually, let's say I had decided that every one of these scallops was a 1/4 inch, an 1/8 of an inch deep. And just for argument's sake, let's look at this, the scallops on this dress. And let's see how tall they are. They are, oh, they're an 1/8 of, an 1/8 plus a 1/16. So they're like 3/16 tall, these scallops, okay? Well, you're facing, if you want, instead of doing an exact trace of the armhole to create a facing, which would be parallel to the armhole, yeah, you could make it slightly smaller. So I really need a super sharp red pencil, but your facing could be, it has to end on exactly the same points inside each scallop, but the part that's out could always be like a 1/16 in. So your facing is slightly smaller than your outside pattern piece. And that will actually help to pull. I mean, you can do this by hand at the iron. You can just roll your seam allowances in, right? So they're not visible on the outside. But you can also, oh, I was to zoom in. You can also create your pattern so that it's actually slightly smaller, not at these points, but up here, so that it actually naturally pulls. Your facing is actually smaller. I know it seems ever so slight, especially here because this is a smaller scale pattern, but it makes a difference, right, guys? Right, ladies? I don't think there's any guys in this group, but there may be. I can't remember. I say guys a lot. Okay, so and that would be your side seam. Oh, and then remember how I told you the extremities of your facing are always at the same exact pinpoint, but come in a little towards the body, but for both front and back facing towards the body, so that you're facing, the free hanging part of your facing is just kind of in towards the body and not sticking out and adding a lump to your garment. Same thing up at the shoulder. We talked about this earlier in today's lesson. It came in a little bit. Makes a big difference, right? And, you know, if you do it to a certain point, you know, it'll be too much. And those are the things. It's like you experiment because it depends what fabric you have. This is all bias here. So if your fabric is very stretchy, bringing it in this much and this much won't make that much of a difference. Because this is the stretchy bias part of your fabric, because your straight grain is here. Hang on. Parallel to center front. But your bias is, you know, running all through here, so it's going to get stretchy. So this is actually just going to, when you stitch this, it's going to end up stretching out to there anyways. Yeah, so that could be my new pattern. So that means that when I add seam allowance to my shoulder, it's got to be parallel to that new line, right? And up here, I want to use a different color than the original line every time I do this, so that you know that it's seam allowance. Okay. And I think I'll teach you one more marking just while we're here, is that like these points that are so specific, you can put a circle around them on your pattern piece and then poke them with an awl. Where'd my awl go? Oh my gosh. Okay, well, here's another one. But oh, here. punch it with an awl. Having those circle marks helps you remember where you have a punch mark. And then you can mark that with a dressmaker pencil or chalk or even with an awl. However, if I'm actually using an awl, then I like my punch marks to be like a 1/4 inch away from where I need to work so that any damage done to the fabric will always be hidden inside the garment. I never want to make a punch mark that's in a place that's going to be visible on my fabric because it always distorts or hurts the fabric a little bit. Oh my gosh, so that was way too much information. TMI. But I know a lot of us, we love to like nerd out, pardon me. So I have this online course, and Alethea was very gracious and said I could give a lesson, do a Q&A or something. So I didn't share it yet, but I will share a link. I'm going to have a coupon for you guys. What was it? It's So Nice, SEWNICE, all one word, So Nice. I'll put that in the caption with a link to the class. You can just read about it a little bit. The online class does a lot of 1/4 scale work, so you can practice. I even teach you how to pin together your 1/4 scale patterns if you want, so you can see how they become 3-dimensional, which is super cool. Some of the patterns we do in the class are also full size. For example, the collar and stuff like that. But I don't want you guys to have to make big patterns all the time. You can use a book or a guide to draft your own slopers that fit you from your measurements and stuff. But first, you don't want to start with that. What you want to start with is understanding the overall principles, because it's very hard to draft a pattern when you don't have any of that confidence about creating curves or adjusting things. So in the class, the first thing we'll do is I'll take a piece of rectangular muslin and put it on a mannequin. You don't have a mannequin to take the class. Put it on the mannequin, pin, pin, pin. I'll show you how to drape a bodice that fits, plus has some ease, how I mark it, how I take it down and smooth out those lines and add markings. And the reason I teach you that is so that you can do that for any body type, but the principles are the same. The pure vertical that is center front, pure horizontal. I mean, as long as you're not working with bias, but we talk about bias too and why those things matter. We'll talk about tools you can use. And one of the truths that really comes down, though, is deep down, we all kind of need a partner for stuff like this. Like, you can't really measure your own back to draft a sloper from. And you can't very well fit it alone either. So it's really easy to work on clients, measure them, fit them. But when you're working for yourself, it's a lot trickier. So personally, when I'm making clothes for myself, or even for a client who I know I don't want to have them over for 100 fittings, I will always, always, always work from a garment that they bring me, that they say fits them great, that they love the way it fits, because that gives me the perfect